What's the most insane coincidence you've experienced? I was once mugged by 4 guys on one of the main shopping streets of Nairobi, Kenya. One of the guys had me in a chokehold, and just before I was about to pass out, they dropped me and ran. At the time I didn't know why. 12 months later, sitting on a beach on an island in Thailand, I meet a British couple who did business in Kenya, and we start to talk about how dangerous it was getting for foreigners. They described an incident the year before of turning a corner and seeing a white guy being mugged, and a shopkeeper rescued him by hitting one of them over the head with a bat. They were in the same street, on the same day, at the exact same time I was there. It was me who they witnessed being mugged. What are the odds of randomly meeting up on a beach in Thailand a year later? I sold my LSAT study books to a half-price bookstore. 2 years later, I found them on the bookshelf of the man I would later marry. I live in Australia and I have for almost my whole life, but I was born in Dubai. Every weekend in Dubai my mum would take me to the Hilton Beach Club and sit me in front of the pastry chef and eat. We moved away from Dubai really early on, so I don't even remember much. Fast forward to 17 years of age, a new kid at school had just moved from a nearby town. We became friends and we both loved cricket, and we practiced a lot together. My dad and I were giving him a lift home after we were practicing, and dad asks, "Where were you born?" and he says Dubai, and the conversation continues and I say I was 2 etc. Then he says, "My parents used to be the pastry chefs at the Hilton Beach Club," and this blew me away. Here we were 16 years later, halfway across the world, and every weekend I sat in front of his parents and ate what they made for me. To this day I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I mean, what are the chances? A few years ago I into a cab heading out for the evening in downtown Toronto. Shortly after being dropped off I realized I left my phone in the cab. I tried calling it with no luck. I called the cab company, but because I had flagged the cab and paid cash they had no real way of knowing which cab I was in. I figured the phone was as good as gone and went about my night. Many hours later, and having moved around the city quite a bit, I am ready to call it a night, so flag another cab. Sitting in the back seat I start to think the driver looks familiar and realize that I'm in the same cab I took earlier. He hasn't found a phone, but I start looking anyways, and sure enough there it is, jammed in the seat. Me and my flip phone were happily reunited, only for me to put it in a washing machine 2 days later. An American friend of mine by the name of Tom took his family on vacation to check out Antarctica. He met an Australian guy named Paul on Christmas Day in Antarctica. They didn't exchange contact info. A year later, Christmas Day, they take their vacation to Machu Picchu. He is looking down at a map when he hears, "Hey Tom, how the heck are you?" It was Paul, taking his family on their annual trip as well. That's just next level stalking. Never could explain this payphone incident. Saturday night out with friends. We decide to call my friend Al to see if he wants to join us. This was in England long before mobile phones, so we had to use one of the iconic red phone booths. Someone was already using it, so we had to wait a few minutes. Guy leaves and we cram in the booth. Now, in those days, in order to make a call you would first get a dial tone, then call the number. When the person answered you would hear a bunch of beeps, at which point you insert a coins. So I pick up the phone but hear no dial tone. I hang the phone up and try again. Still no dial tone. Seems to be still connected to the previous call. I say hello to see if anyone is still on the line. Person answers hello. It was my friend Al. He had just picked up his phone to make a call, and somehow, miraculously, without even dialing his number, we were connected. We all went to the pub after and tried to figure out how the heck this happened, but it remains a mystery. If I did not have my friends with me at the time as witnesses, I would have believed it was my mind playing tricks on me. This is when you start believing the Truman Show is about you. In 2004 I was 18 and on a 3-week tour of Europe. I was at the Louvre and had just experienced the clusterfuck that was the Mona Lisa exhibit. After looking at it for 2 minutes I started to wander around aimlessly. As I was walking, an older couple asked if I knew how to get to the Mona Lisa exhibit. I told them yes, and because I'm horrible with directions, I'd be happy to walk them there myself. They were really nice and very appreciative that I was taking time to help them. They asked me where I was from. US in Nashville, but I mentioned my parents were immigrants from Italy. They told me they were from Portugal on anniversary. We talked a bit more, told them my name, and they were really excited about since I shared the same name as their grandchild. Anyways, we get to the exhibit and I go to part ways and shake their hands but get pulled in for 2 massive hugs and a kiss on the cheek. They give me their address and say anytime I'm in Portugal to stop by and I'll have a place to stay and eat. We take a group photo and leave. 7 years later I'm in Munich for Oktoberfest. I'm standing outside my hotel waiting for my friends when an older couple ask if I know how to get to the fairgrounds. Again, I'm crap with directions, so since I'm headed there I tell them they can just follow me and my friends. Again we start talking about where we are all from. Now, I have a memory like an elephant, and once they mention they're from Portugal I start to think maybe these are the same people. I ask them if they have grandkids and they say they have 6. I ask if one of their names is historiophiman. They look at each other sort of surprised and say yes. They ask how do I know that, and tell them that I had met them 7 years prior in Paris at the Louvre. The old lady gets really happy and starts crying and starts to hug me. They say they remembered me now and asked why I never came to visit, that they had our picture in a frame on their wall and always wondered what happened to the nice American boy. We spent the next 3 hours drinking beers and catching up. Luckily we got there early so we were able to get an empty table and they bought all the beers the entire time. This time they demanded I give them my email so we could keep in contact. I even added their son on Facebook. 2 years later I go and visit for the summer and sure enough there on the wall amongst the rest of their family pictures is 18 years old me standing between them. In high school, my friend set me up with her boyfriend's cousin. Let's call him Jack. Jack and I were walking around an amusement park and started talking about recent family spring break vacations. Turns out, both Jack and I had been in Las Vegas during the same week. We stayed at the same hotel. The conversation changed subjects when Jack stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and said, "I saw you in Las Vegas." I thought he was full of crap. There's no way he would remember some random girl among the thousands of people there. He told me the exact place he saw me, and that my sister and I were posing for a photo. We got back to my house and found the picture. There were Jack and his brother in the background. When I was in grade 2, our family moved from Manitoba to Arizona for a year due to a contract my dad was working. We rented out the house fully furnished for the year. While in Arizona, we flew to Alberta one weekend. On the flight from Arizona to Alberta, I sat beside a boy my age and we started talking. It went something like this. Me: "What city are you from?" Him: "Winnipeg." Me too." Me: "What school do you go to?" Him: "School name." Me: "Cool. I used to go there too." Me: "What street do you live on?" Him: "Street name." Me: "I lived on that street." It turns out, his family was renting our house while we were gone. So I was sitting beside the boy who was sleeping in my bed while we were in Arizona. About 10 years ago I tried to get into Six Flags with a tiny keychain Swiss Army knife. It literally had a dull 1" blade. They told me I could either throw it away, take it to my car a mile away, or rent a locker for like $10. So I decided to hide it in the planter. I looked down and saw a big piece of bark laying in the dirt and figured it would be a good hiding place. I picked it up and found another freaking mini Swiss Army knife. I placed mine next to the first and went into the park. When I returned, the other knife was gone and a smiley face was etched into the dirt in its place. My family used to take little summer vacations. One summer, I was about 7-8, we stayed at a campground about 4 hours from home. There were a bunch of kids there and one day we all started playing tag. I was IT and was chasing another young boy, and when I tagged him, I pushed him too hard and he fell and broke his arm. I remember the scene vividly. Fast forward to college. I became good friends with my neighbor in the dorm, and we ended up getting a place together our sophomore year. The following year we went out for a few beers and the topic of broken bones came up. I've only broken one bone, and it was my arm when I was 7. Some kid at a campground pushed me over while playing tag. It was me. Still can't believe it. My first semester of college, I moved out of state. I was first to move into the apartment and had a few days to myself. After orientation I found my new roommate sitting on his bed. When I introduced myself, he asked where I was from. When I told him, he said, "I used to have a friend named Simon." I said I used to have a friend named Will. We were best friends in 1st and 2nd grade until his family moved. When I was in high school, I was aimlessly playing around our library one day. Like any large public high school, our library had literally thousands of books quietly tucked away in shelves, and rarely, if ever, touched. That day I pulled a book at random from a shelf in the back, and sat down to read it. After opening it, a slip of paper fell out, and I quickly recognized the -10 digits written on it as a phone number. I hastily read the number, and it was my older sister's number, who had graduated my high school years earlier. Someone wrote a number and tucked it away into a random book in the back, until I found it years later. As a college sophomore, I went on a trip to France by myself. I was sitting in Notre Dame Cathedral, listening to music, when a girl I dated in high school sat down near me, totally at random. We were both speechless when we saw one another there, out of the blue, in a foreign country within a vast cathedral. All while Quasimodo looked down sadly, knowing his only love forever out of reach. This coincidence is straight up sorcery. Was kayaking with my family along a river when I thought I would pull a fast one on my brother. So I yell, "Hey, look, a bald eagle," to my brother so I can do the whole "made you look" game. But to my surprise he goes cool. At this point I think he is just messing with me, so I can't say the whole "made you look" thing. So then I look up and a bald eagle swoops down, catches a fish and flies to the other side of the river. One of the most magical coincidences ever. Go out to dinner to celebrate my wife's birthday. Sat next to a couple. We start talking. The wife is also celebrating her birthday and it's on the same day. Haha. Crazy. We hit it off and exchanged information to hang out again. 2 months later I invite them to my birthday party and turns out the husband has the same birthday as me. My aunt died young on the 3rd of October of 2007. On the 2nd of October, 2008, I was a senior in high school. I was in my art class one morning sitting at a table of 4, when the teacher tells one person from each table to go and grab a stack of newspapers for us to sculpt on so that the tables don't get all messed up with clay. Another guy spreads out the newspapers and then I begin to work. I noticed that the paper at my seat is the obituary pages. I casually begin to read it and realize that the paper is a year old and the obituary listing exactly under my right hand was that of my aunt, who had died a full 365 days before. I'd like to think it was her way of saying hello and what's up, and to make sure I wasn't sculpting anything grossly inappropriate. I once burped 1 second before a power blackout on my neighborhood. It felt almighty. This reminds me of something that happened in high school. I was joking around with one of my friends, and I told her I could blow stuff up with my head. She said, "Prove it." Right then there was a loud boom, and the power went out. Turned out one of the school's power transformers had blown up. This happened to me a few months ago, and it was pretty dang improbable. I'm walking through BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, where an average of 375,000 people pass through daily. I walk up the escalator to my train, and pass by an envelope lying on the ground. At first I didn't think much of it, but I took a couple steps back to pick it up anyways. The next part freaked me out. I looked at the address, and it was addressed to me. I instantly look around to see if it was a practical joke, or if I'm about to get assassinated or something. Neither of those were the case. The sender was a family friend. We'll call them the Johnsons. I knew that Mr. Johnson took the BART daily, but I had never personally ran into him. After work, I call him up and ask him about the letter. Turns out, he had about 300 letters with him on the BART, and was going to send them out for his daughter's graduation party. What in the world are the chances of him dropping the one letter addressed to me out of the 300, combined with the chances of me being the one out of 375,000 people to pick it up? Pretty wild. When I was a little kid, my parents would take my sister and I to visit my great-grandmother in the nursing home. She was mid-90s, blind, and to young me basically terrifying. I hated going to see her, to be honest. Every time we went she would touch our faces, you know, because blind, and talk to us a little. Meanwhile, her roommate somehow knew my name and would always try and grab me, even though my parents never said more to her than pleasantries. Always freaked me out. Fast forward to my mid-20s. My dad mentions, just casually as anything, that the roommate was his grandmother and my other great grandmother. She didn't know my name. I am a junior and look like my dad, so she thought I was my father. She was senile after all. Apparently there was a falling out when my dad was a kid and he had no relationship with much of his extended family. She didn't recognize my dad because she'd never seen him as an adult. The fricked up thing is they lived in a city nursing home. Pretty big city too, and just by sheer freaking coincidence my parents' grandparents were roommates. I met my now husband at work. Turns out there are enough coincidences that my mom is seriously wondering whether we are distantly related. We were born in the same hospital, 2 weeks apart. We then both moved about 500 miles away and ended up in the same university together. We moved from there another 100 miles away and worked in the same company. We both have relatives in the same area in Dublin. We both have a relative that worked in the same hotel in Dublin at about the same time back in the 1930s. My mom and his grandmother have the exact same combination of unusual first and middle names. When I was about 12 it was the late 90s and I was really big into Pokemon cards. My mom took me to a card shop and I really wanted a Dragonite. But it was like $12 or whatever. My mom said, why don't you just get 2 card packs for that money? You get way more cards. Obviously she didn't understand what the frick a Dragonite was, but she only ended up buying me a pack. First card fricking Dragonite. It was crazy. When I was 11, I was in the park like half a mile from my house and I was flying a Winnie the Pooh kite. I was the only kid around with a kite at the time, and I was pretty zoned into it, and didn't notice when the string came loose. 100 feet of twine zoomed away and out of reach, and Pooh Bear was gone. Later that night, my family and I went out to eat, and when we came home there was a string dangling from the gutter above our front door. My dad grabbed it and started pulling. The string seemed to go all the way up into the night sky. We couldn't see the end of it. 100 feet of pulling later, there was my Pooh Bear kite. It came back to me. Were you ever that 1 in 1 million? If so, what's your story? I was struck by lightning while talking on a landline. This was in the early 90s. Lightning struck the telephone line and traveled through the handset to my ear. My parents drove me to the ear. I couldn't talk very well. My brain knew what I wanted to say, but my mouth didn't want to say it. I had a terrible stutter. My doctor told me that I had had a dose of good, old-fashioned electroshock therapy. My speech was normal the next day, but I get a terrible headache whenever a thunderstorm comes through. I get a terrible headache whenever a thunderstorm comes through. That's just your brain shouting stay away from the freaking phone. You Orion over 89. I slept wrong one night and pinched a nerve in my neck so severely I lost the right side of my body. It just went silent like it wasn't there for months. I woke up in the worst pain I've ever experienced and couldn't talk, move or do anything. The doctor thought I was having a stroke. My doctor had never seen a case as severe as mine and it was purely a freak accident. Recovery took months but I have use of my leg and hand again, with some numbness. Other than pain and spasms I'm mostly back to normal. For my 7th birthday we went to Disneyland. They just happened to be having a car a day giveaway when we were there. For my 7th birthday, Mickey Mouse gave me a Pontiac Firebird. I have a very rare skin disease that only 1 in a million people get. I've been told that I'll probably never meet another person in my lifetime with it. Haley disease for those interested. So rare they named it twice. Edit. According to approximately 624 other redditors, Manhattan is the other name. I once guessed a 6-digit random combination on the first try. It was the only try I planned to give, as a kind of scratch pad whatever moment. Literally 1 in a million. I was in 2 separate car crashes in 2 separate cars in less than 45 minutes apart. Edit. I wasn't the driver for either crash. First car was hit from the side. Friend came and picked us up. Car lost traction and we slid off the road and hit a pole. Neither was that bad, just poor timing. I was 2, if you count the ambulance. Someone pulled out in front of me and I hit them because I had no time to brake. Had some bad back pain so an ambulance took me to the hospital. On the way there, someone pulled out in front of them. Diagnosed with an extremely rare liver disease, primary hyperoxaluria. Some 300 people in the United States currently have it. Basically pass a lot of kidney stones and need a double transplant to fix. I'm on the donor registry. I hope you find your match soon. 3. Not sure if this is a blessing or a curse, but I'm an extremely tall human. 7'3". Yes, really. Not sure how rare that is. 1 in 1.6 million of being over 7 feet tall. 1 in 2 of being asked how's the weather up there. I've got the middle toes on both feet webbed. So did Stalin. Quack. This feels like a fun fact but at the same time a threat. My ex was struck by lightning several times and lived. Died in a car accident though, so not as lucky as he claimed to be. Being struck by lightning once isn't lucky. Being struck by lightning multiple times is lucky. I was on Tinder and was talking to this guy. He was supposed to meet me for dinner. I texted him and no answer. Then I texted him on Tinder. Said that he couldn't make it. However, I got a text back from the number. It wasn't the guy that I thought I texted. It was the actor Gerard Butler. I thought he was lying until he FaceTimed me. Nice guy. Edit. First, I didn't go on a date with him instead. He lives on the west coast and I live on the east coast. I didn't keep his number because I respect his privacy. When he FaceTimed me he was super casual and asked me why I was using Tinder and he wished me luck on it. I'm allergic to potatoes. Never met someone else who is, so I guess it's 1 in a million. Never eating chips or fries. Not me, but my mom is allergic to potatoes. Never met someone else with a potato allergy except my mom. Wow. How I met my wife. I'm from the Netherlands. She is from the US. We met in Israel. It was my first weekend in Israel. Decided to go on a pub crawl to meet some people and have fun. As I'm buying the ticket, my now wife walks up to the counter to also buy our ticket. The girl working there introduces us. We hit it off the first night, but I'm leaving in 2 days to stay with friends of friends in the middle of the desert for 3 months. 2 days after I leave I lose my phone. Don't have any way to get back in touch with her. I had little money and could stay work with the people in the desert. But I kept thinking about her, so after a week I say I'm leaving. Take the next bus. Goes 3 times a week. At 5 AM. And then a train to Tel Aviv. I had no idea how to find her, where to stay and very little money. I email a couple hostels to find a work stay agreement. Those jobs are very popular and usually planned months in advance. I get an email back when I arrive in Tel Aviv. I can come in for an interview because they have a spot. This is already ridiculously lucky. Right after the interview and dropping off my belongings, I went back to the first hostel to see if they would give me information. They wouldn't give me anything. Now I'm at a loss. Tel Aviv is a city of more than 500,000 people. I don't know anyone and have little more than the clothes on my back. Kind of defeated, I start wandering around exploring the city. After a couple hours I get hungry and decide to treat myself to a restaurant. I'm well out of the tourist area and find a place that's almost empty and rather cheap. I sit down, order a drink and something to eat. As I get my food I see my now wife walking past the restaurant. She sees me, I see her. I'm literally dumbstruck and just kind of grin and wave. Remember how I lost my phone? She didn't know that and just thought I ignored her. She waves and keeps walking. I throw like 200 shekels, way too much, in the table and sprint after her. Explained, and the rest is history. This is a great story. Glad you found each other. I was diagnosed with leukemia. I got a bacteria growth which killed the leukemia. A real 1 in 1 million chance. I almost died thanks to that bacteria though. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Got a rare but potentially deadly rash from a medication. I laughed when I first saw the bottle with the warning and said knowing my luck I'd get it. I did. Ended up in a burn unit with my skin sloughing off. Not a fun week. No sure about the odds on this one, but I survived a non-survivable plane crash. I was on an old Po2, famous for being very safe and uncrushable, on a tour of the desert in western China when I was like 7. My father's friend who hosted me and piloted the plane didn't survive, but somehow I got out with a concussion and apparently passed out for almost a day in the middle of the desert, in the wreckage of the crash, 50 kilometers from the town airport, on the edge of the desert. The people who found me were some tree planters. They plant greens in the desert to protect towns from sandstorm. A lot of people live in these desert towns in China do this. Found me on their way picking up a shipment, and the only reason they looked was BC they were making a bet on how fast the egg would cook in the sand and went off the road to test. I have the rarest type of synesthesia, lexical gustatory. It means I taste words. I am allergic to the cold, like literally. I get intense hives, swelling, I pass out, and throw up. Doesn't even have to be freezing. Below 45 degrees without a jacket and I can't do it. I have to carry an EpiPen with me in the event that I drink something too cold or have a severe reaction. Please tell me you moved somewhere warm. This is my mum's story. She once called her friend, back in the day on the landline, and another lady answered. My mum asks if her friend was there and the lady says sure I'll get her. My mum's friend hops on the phone and asks how she knew she was here. Turns out my mum got a number wrong when dialing. Called a random house where someone was hosting a Tupperware party and my mum's friend just happened to be attending it. What are the odds of that crap? Took me way too long to realize you meant how did she know she was here. I thought I was having a stroke lol. My brain kept trying to read it normally. I own a Lego minifigure called Mr. Gold. This particular minifig was to celebrate the 10th series of the Lego figurine line. They are sort of like grab bags. You can feel for them but you don't know what minifigure you're really going to get. So because they were celebrating they thought it was a good idea to only make $5,000 of these. Anyways, when I was younger and even now I was really good knowing which figures they are simply by looking at the figures pieces and feeling out those pieces. I really like the minifigures cause I thought they were really cool and unique so I really wanted Mr. Gold and me and my mom hunted for it for a long time but after a while I gave up. Then one day I was at the Lego store and felt the distinct diamond piece and freaked out. Finding this figure was a downright fantasy. I'm 18 now and still want to relive 12-year-old me's pure joy as he opened the packaging. OMG, I've always wanted Mr. Gold. I love those little mystery packs. The first one I don't know about the exact odds, but I was born on the 7th of July 1977 and weighed 7 pounds and 7 ounces. Sadly though I clocked in at 6:50 am. The other is that around the age of 14 I started to notice the outsides of both of my feet starting to get much wider. After a couple of years of buying expensive custom made shoes they decided to perform surgery on my feet. It turned out I had extra muscle growth along with something else I don't recall at the moment. My podiatrist told me he submitted a scholarly article on it. May also have been genetic as when my dad was 3, he developed an extra toe growing out of each one of his big toes. So close to 77 am. When I was a teenager I had just started working at the local Sears Auto Center Express Lube shop and on day 1 did a quick orientation and my first oil change. The manager walked away when he felt I was good to go and the oil change went well. Fast forward a few days later my manager asked me to come into his office and he explained that the oil filter I had used had one huge flaw. I didn't know what that was and it turned out the filter was pressed on backwards into the filter can and it wouldn't allow oil to flow in and it damaged the motor. They had to purchase a new motor for the person and I still kept my job. He said it was a 1 in a million chance that would have happened and it did on my first oil change. They have insurance for a reason. All sorts of weird stuff happened at our Walmart. Defective tires, filters, oil, you name it. They don't hold the employees accountable for their weird stuff. I was diagnosed with a rare cancer that happens in males more often than females. Usually happens to patients between 45 and 60 and happens in the abdomen or legs. I was a 34-year-old female and it happened in my right arm. For the record I am in remission, but I couldn't believe I defied everything about the stupid sucker. As a driver in Seattle, I use my turn signal. I had AFM, acute flaccid myelitis, when I was really young. It's like weak polio if that makes sense. My legs struggled to keep me up and I was consistently collapsing. However, the disease wasn't discovered at the time so I wasn't diagnosed. I was in and out of hospital several times a week, being tested for all sorts of bone cancers. When the disease was discovered I matched every description of it perfectly. But now, I am running cross country and doing alright. I have TMJ disorder, an uncommon chronic issue where my jaw clicks and hurts sometimes. I was temporarily put on some medication, baclofen, to ease the pain. The medication has a rare withdrawal effect that leads to schizophrenic paranoid psychosis. When I ended the medication, I heard voices and chanting, saw hallucinations, thought my roommates were trying to poison me, experienced grandiose delusions, the whole 9 yards. Why 1 in a million? The withdrawal effect has a 2-4% occurrence rate in patients who received the meds via spinal injection regularly for several years, and normal dosage is 300 mg day. I was taking the medication orally, pills, at 5 mg day and hadn't been on it for more than 2 weeks, making my case so rare that there've only been 16 known instances of similar occurrences worldwide. Oh man, that's nuts. Hope you're doing okay. Psychosis is scary AF. Uterus ruptured into my bladder after birth of my youngest. It was 1/4 in, away from a major artery. Nearly died. Whoa, the human body sucks at giving birth : hope you're better now. Aggressive fallopian tube cancer. 2 years later I had a malignant pleural tumor. Also have late diagnosis of stage 2 and 3 urogenital reflux, which is usually discovered before a kid is out of diapers. I was too old for the surgeons to fix it properly. Also I'm a redhead with blue eyes, hitchhiker thumb, double jointed and have double row of eyelashes, and my kid is a pretty close copy despite her bio dad having dominant genes, half Japanese. When I graduated high school I was offered a full ride scholarship, entirely based on academic merit, to study the program I loved more than anything at the school I'd dreamed of going to for years. The school in question was notorious for giving very few scholarships, and the particular scholarship I won is awarded to very few students each year. I'm still pinching myself sometimes. Hey man, you didn't win it, you earned it. I lived in Florida for the first 18 years of my life and spent most of my free time outdoors, fishing, camping, what have you. The summer before my junior year of high school I found myself out hiking nearby by my home with a buddy. We were stomping around in some clay deposits inside of a little ravine. Even minimal geographic relief is dramatic in a place as flat as the Gulf Coast. When it started to Florida rain, for those of you who can't relate, imagine a torrential downpour. Our minds immediately jumped to the exciting possibility of a flash flood raging through the crevasses we were exploring. In an effort to make our day more exciting and not take any chances, we began to climb vertically out of the canyons versus take the lengthy path out of it horizontally. We got to the top, put our feet on the ground, and did pull up. As I stood up I felt the ground underneath me squirm. I had stepped on a snake. I screamed and kicked the snake that was latched onto my foot off me by reflex. As an Eagle Scout, I immediately recognized the red on yellow pattern as the snake slithered away and knew it was a coral snake. We rushed home, drove to the hospital, and were seen. The doctors informed my parents the nearest intervenin was a 3-hour helicopter ride away. The first symptom, lung failure, would occur after 2 hours. My parents called my friends and family and we all spent time together without me knowing my fate. My friends and family arrived and subsequently left together. My parents turned off the lights and we prayed together. Around 2 hours after being bitten, a nurse came into our dark room with gurney to collect my dead body. I asked the nurse has there been any developments. To her surprise, the doctors came in, shocked I was alive, told me it was a dry bite, and that I should remain whatever religion I practiced. Edit. The 1 in 1 million is mainly getting bitten by the snake in the first place, but also subsequently surviving. I'm shocked that they wouldn't even try to get you the meds, even if it was a long shot. Serious, doctors of Reddit, what is the rarest condition you have diagnosed and how did you come to that conclusion? Bit of an off-the-wall one. Elderly lady came into my practice asking if there was anything she could be given to help her sleep as the Irish terrorists in the flat below were keeping her awake at night. She was reassured that terrorists were not planning to blow her up, or Cannock, a small inconsequential town in the West Midlands. For that matter, on the second visit, she insisted that they were going to blow something up soon and expressed paranoid thoughts. A full mental health review was conducted by the GP and the community psychiatrist. She came up clean. That's when we contacted the police. A couple of days later the flat below our patient was raided and found to be full of bomb-making equipment and real IRA members. How often have I said to you that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Wolman disease, a genetic disease that affects about 1/200,000 kids, terrible outcome. It leads to calcification of the adrenal glands, which is how I picked it up on a chest x-ray on call. I'm a radiologist. The kid had failure to thrive and a big spleen, so I brought it up. He got further testing which confirmed the diagnosis. Bottom line, don't forget to look at the adrenals or ribs on PEDS rays. Don't miss that neuroblastoma or child abuse case, or Wolman disease. I'll make sure I always remember that. I'm a carpenter, so it probably won't help much, but I won't forget. Ooh, I've got a few good ones, but I'll share one in particular. I can't remember all the details though, so bear with me. I'm at a big tertiary hospital and had an elderly veteran brought to us one day after being found unconscious in a park. He had alcohol in his system and a quick look at his records showed that this was an ongoing problem with him. He was a sweet old man who was very grateful for our help, up until day 3 of his hospitalization. He developed pneumonia-like symptoms and became somnolent for a few days. Then, out of nowhere, he became very inappropriate. He begins grabbing the nurses and propositioning them sexually, masturbating, or at least attempting to, and constantly licking his lips in a sexual manner when anyone even looked at him. He went from a sweet old man to a sexual deviant almost overnight. We even had to wrap his hands up in bandages to stop him from touching himself and others. Oddly though, he hit on anyone and everyone, women and men, except for me. I guess I wasn't his type. LOL. We ended up diagnosing him with Kluver-Bucy syndrome, caused by HSV encephalitis, herpes. Symptoms include hypersexuality and hyperorality. It's pretty rare and I haven't seen it since, but as you might imagine, it left a lasting impression on me. He improved with treatment though, and was incredibly embarrassed after finding out what he had done. When I was on PEDSID, we had a young girl come in with a rash on the bottom of her feet. She was also having headaches and joint pains. We spent close to an hour interviewing the girl and the mother. Her history was essentially negative. Finally, as a last-ditch effort, I pulled out the weird questions you ask in med school. I asked if they had any unusual pets, as we had already ruled out normal pets. They said actually they did just return a pet rat for biting her. They thought that this wasn't really relevant. Bam. Rat bite fever. We had a case a couple of years ago that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. Younger girl goes to her PCP in a small town outside of the bigger city where I live. Care of persistent headaches, which just started a few days ago. No past medical history of anything similar or really at all about her that stood out as relevant. Unable to diagnose or treat her headaches, which were rapidly growing more severe, she was sent to our hospital, X-State's Children's Hospital, for evaluation. We ran her through the typical gauntlet of testing for common causes, CBC, CMB, CT, MRI, etc. Still with no clue. Nothing came up on blood cultures either. At this point she was in the PICU, rapidly deteriorating, with high fevers, periodic losses of consciousness. After eliminating all the horses, we had to start looking for zebras, and quick. We collected a CSF sample for culture thinking it might be one of the rarer forms of bacterial meningitis. While this was cooking, cultures usually take at least a few days. We tried again to get any other possible info from her parents. For the first time, they mentioned that they had visited a local water park a week or 2 before the girl's symptoms started, and this was in the middle of summer. For any peds doc, or especially a doc in the room, those words made their hearts sink. Sure enough, the cultures came back, positive for Naegleria fowleri, the pathogen responsible for primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, PAM, which up until that point, I don't think there was a documented case of a patient being diagnosed with PAM who survived. It's the incurable brain-eating amoeba that lives in warm stagnant water, and can enter through the cribriform plate at the top of the nose if the patient gets water up there, which happens all the time at water parks. Anyways, long story short, we basically cook up a, very non-FDA approved, drug cocktail as a sort of Hail Mary attempt at fighting this infection, as nothing else in any other case had ever worked. In addition to this, we basically stick her in a Mr. Freeze chamber, lowering her body temp to below what 10 fowleri can usually survive. Unfortunately, most people can't survive it either, but for some reason, though in an induced coma the whole time, she steadily improved. When we took her out of the deep freeze and allowed her to wake up, it was incredible. She was alive with no apparent neurocognitive deficits, and the new cultures showed no growth of N. fowleri. It's not too hard to figure out where this occurred, as it may still be the only successfully treated case in the US. Late to the game, but I think of this situation often. Not rare, but an interesting presentation. I am internal medicine. Mid-40s female patient of mine has an appointment to discuss vaginal bleeding after intercourse. She has had a hysterectomy and so had no periods. She was, of course, concerned about some sort of a cancerous process, especially since there was no pain or discomfort when she noticed the bleeding. Full workup, she's perfectly healthy. We have a mystery. Once she is cleared, I ask about her husband. I tell her to have him masturbate and report back to me. Lo and behold, he had blood in his ejaculate. Now, I've seen Reddit posts about hemispermia, blood in the ejaculate, so don't freak out if you've had it before. It's actually not that unusual, but in rare cases, it can be a sign of underlying prostate cancer. In this case, we did eventually diagnose prostate cancer in this upper 40s male. He had his surgery and is doing well today. My father was in medicine and he used to talk about the elation when he would diagnose something that other doctors missed. That feeling was short-lived, replaced by that feeling of oh crap when you realize your patient has a life-threatening illness. It's an odd profession we're in. Holy crap, that's like Sherlock-level detective work there. I can't imagine what her reaction was when you told her to have the husband masturbate though. Baby born without a nose and with non-functioning eyes. Diagnosed with Bosma syndrome. Kinda crazy. Saw the baby a few months later and it was doing fine. Children with Bosma syndrome grow up without any cognitive disabilities. It's very interesting. I am an anesthesiologist now, but was a doctor in charge of a small rural hospital in India about 20 years ago. Here are a couple of interesting ones from those days. An elderly lady was brought to the hospital by an irate husband who felt she was faking an illness. She would lie in a room all day with doors and windows shut and complained of a headache. She refused to do housework or look after the kids. Other doctors who had seen her before me had treated her for pain with no improvement. I examined the patient, who complained of severe headache and just wanted to lie down and refused to open her eyes. I admitted her to the hospital and performed CSF tap, a needle into the lumbar spine to get a sample of fluid surrounding the spinal cord. As expected, it was tinged yellow. Cerebrospinal fluid should be clear. These days we have CT scans to diagnose subarachnoid hemorrhage, bleeding around the brain, but it was a difficult diagnosis once upon a time. On another occasion, I was visiting a friend's house when I was introduced to his dad who had no medical issues. He was a hard-working farmer, but looked a bit too thin. Something told me there was something not quite right and so I asked him if I could examine him. I promptly discovered hard lymph nodes in several areas. Further investigations revealed he had disseminated cancer. He died less than a year later. Morning report was a good one today. We had a 59-year-old male come in with lower leg swelling. Within 3 days he becomes confused, febrile and stiff. We put him in the ICU thinking meningitis and got some CSF cultures and started antibiotics. 2 days later the cultures were still negative and he wasn't improving. His wife then says this whole event seems similar to his husband's, the patient's, mom. She had Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and passed from it. It's a 1 in a million literally. Diagnosis and our tests are still coming back for it. Really rare case most doctors will never see. My uncle died of CJD. Absolutely horrific. My mother cared for him closely and can no longer give blood. When I was an intern, we had a 22-year-old man with persistent abdominal pain. All studies negative. His symptoms were unexplained. His mother was constantly at his bedside and his medical history, which was extensive, according to his mom, included multiple hospital stays with no definitive diagnosis. I noticed that he would frequently take ill after meals, which his mother brought from outside the hospital. It eventually became clear that he was a victim of Munchausen by proxy. His mother was making him ill. I'd had a patient with Munchausen's when I was in medical school. She was injecting her own feces into her IV, so I was particularly tuned in. Both cases were very sad. I've diagnosed anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis in a patient that was thought to be withdrawing from an unknown drug. Then not 2 months later I had another patient with the same disease. I was talking to a neurologist recently and he thought it was a condition that is far more common than we thought it was, but still a pretty good catch for an internist. I've caught a few conditions that were error, but it's nice to talk about one that's treatable. My first rotation as a medical student was psychiatry. I was really nervous and made a flashcard for each psych condition and a list of diagnoses to consider. One of the patients being discussed on rounds was psychotic. Think, KGB is after me, but was otherwise put together. He was really into doing art and was very religious. I looked at my flashcard for psychosis and casually mentioned that we should consider temporal lobe epilepsy, which presents with religiosity and exaggerated artistic ability, and he showed that he had it. I've caught a few zebras since, but that was my favorite. 6-month baby not getting bigger and dropping off the growth charts. Baby won't move and cry all day long. I couldn't figure it out. I was making preparations to transfer baby to the university hospital for admission. One of the clinic nurses commented that the baby's cry sounded like a cat. Ding! A bell went off in my head. Cri-do chat syndrome or cat's cry syndrome. Very rare. I looked it up on Updoot and the baby had high probability of having it. I referred her to genetics and they confirmed it. The attending called me and marveled at my clinical skills. I chuckled and told him the nurse diagnosed it. Good news. Baby had a small deletion of the 5p chromosome and managed to stay somewhat healthy and functional. My cousin has Cri-do chat. He's 27, and it's amazing he's survived this long. He's got a laundry list of severe physical and developmental disabilities and complications, but he's one of the most gentle and happy people you'll ever meet. We had a good case a few years ago. An otherwise healthy 40-year-old migrant worker from Central America started coughing up blood intermittently. Everything suggested tuberculosis. History from area with lots of TB. Chest x-ray looked like tuberculosis. Illness script looked like tuberculosis. But his tests for it, sputum and gold, were all negative. I decided to test his urine on a whim to rule out pulmonary renal pathologies. Ding, ding, ding. Blood, lots of blood. The patient never noticed it, and his kidney function was superb, so this was a tricky diagnosis. Turns out he had granulomatosis with polyangiitis, Wegener's. Kinda a sad story, because TB is largely curable, but with Wegener's he'll be on chemo for a long time with this disease. I'm glad we caught it before irrevocable damage to his organs, though. I'm a pharmacist in a smallish town, 35,000 people, in the UK and have 5 patients with Wegener's, GPA. Given it's got an incidence rate of around 1 in 125,000 in the UK, I find it a bit odd and can't help but wonder if there's some form of environmental trigger going on. As a third-year medical student, I had a patient come in with 4 years of worsening balance and slurred speech. She had gotten a crazy workup at an outside hospital system with every sort of imaging possible, biopsies of random sites, and a number of very expensive tests. She was at our university hospital for our first time. When I first entered the room, I reached to shake her hand, and from her wheelchair she had to raise her head at me because she couldn't look up with her eyes. This was the first red flag. I also asked her if she had the sensation where one of her limbs would move without her controlling it, and she said yes, suggesting something called alien limb phenomenon. I diagnosed her with progressive supranuclear palsy with features of corticobacillar degeneration, a very rare disease on the spectrum of Parkinson plus syndromes, and my supervisors agreed. Unfortunately, it was a bad prognosis, but the family was consoled by the fact that at least they had a name for what was happening. A couple stick out in my mind. The first one was not rare in the traditional sense, more like a misdiagnosis. A woman came in with severe opiate withdrawal and some shortness of breath. Because she was so insistent about how miserable she was, everyone sort of wrote her off to drug seeking. The morning I rounded on her, I decided to do a thorough physical exam. Lo and behold, she has a hard non-mobile clavicular lymph node. It was so big that it was impossible to miss if you just did the exam. Immediately we got a chest x-ray and then a CT. There was a perihilar mass. After a biopsy we learned it was small cell carcinoma, lung cancer. The second was during a delivery. A baby had intrauterine growth restriction, IUGR, and was born premature. Whenever there is IUGR, there is a concern for congenital anomalies. Sure enough, as soon as the baby was born, I could tell there was a genetic defect. It was Treacher-Collins syndrome. Although it is pretty rare, it is very easy to diagnose because the facial dysmorphia is quite distinct. Patient came in with an itchy rash that would not go away for weeks and new swelling of the mouth and tongue. She had hives all over her body, and the only thing that had helped was repeated steroids. PT was a mid-40s female who worked with dogs, so we assumed that she had a new allergy to pet dandruff, fragrance and a shampoo, flea medicine, something. Discharged her home with an appointment for the dermatologist to do a biopsy of the lesions. Later that day, she turns back up in the emergency department with swollen lips, increased rash, and trouble breathing. She started having these problems 15 minutes after eating a roast beef sandwich. Someone on the team remembered that she works with dogs and asked if she'd had any recent tick bites. Sure enough, she had been bitten by a tick a few weeks ago and identified a picture of a Lone Star tick. Turns out she had developed an allergy to red meat after a bite from that tick. This allergy is called alpha-galactosidase allergy and is a reaction to a carbohydrate carried on the outside of cells. Think like the carbohydrates on red blood cells for Abo blood type, by all other mammals except humans and monkeys. The tick had bitten one of these and kept some of the protein in its digestive system, and then after biting her, her body developed antibodies to the carbohydrate, causing her to have a new allergy to meat. Ordered an abdominal ultrasound on a refugee from Iraq via Syria, expecting to find gallstones because she felt full easily after eating and was having pain in her right upper quadrant. Instead of gallstones, there were 2 7cm cysts in her liver, hydatid cysts from a tapeworm. As a 4th year during my rotations, I noticed my patient had a vertical subluxation of her crystalline lens during a dilated eye examination. The part of eye that develops a cataract later on in life was shifted significantly up. She had severe myopia and astigmatism, minus 14.00 to 5.00 x 180 OU, and her 6 feet 1 inches body along with disfigured teeth led me to believe she had Marfan syndrome. She had never heard of it, never seen a cardiologist, etc. A few lab tests confirmed she can live a normal life, just needs some meds and education. Edie referred a guy to me who had a platelet count of 2. The guy looked bloody sick, abdo pain, petechial rash, feverish, diaphoretic, a bit confused and drowsy too. Talked to my boss who said to give him prednisolone and he'd see him tomorrow, but I was convinced this guy had a really rare condition called TTP, thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, and so I called the major hospital in my area and sent him to their ICU for a procedure called plasma exchange. I ordered a test called ADAMTS13 to prove the condition. Still have a paper copy of the result. He had none of this chemical, because it's the best diagnosis I've ever made, helped save his life. I don't know how many platelets a person should normally have, but 2 sounds like the kind of result where you call the people who did the test to make sure they didn't make a typo. What has been the biggest coincidence you've experienced in your life so far? In 1983, at the age of 12, I got a concussion horsing around with my brother. We were poor and homeless, so it was a couple of days before my mom took me to one of several local hospitals. So, I wound up there for a few more days which were very foggy. Anyway, there was this one nurse who would stop by and be so sweet and brought me cookies and whatnot. I was smitten but never saw her my last day there. Fast forward about 7 years and I am delivering auto parts for a local Napa. I get to be good buddies with the parts coordinator at a very large construction company, and he keeps going on and on about his best friend's wife. She's so wonderful, sweet and all, and he wishes his wife were cool like this guy's wife. I mean, I listened to this dude gush about her nearly every day for 6 months. About 2 years later I met and soon after married my wife, who incidentally, is 14 years older than me. Through talking, which is the great denominator our relationship, I come to realize that my wife is not only the nurse 12 Wyoming was amored with, but also the then wife of the guy's best friend. In just one more unsubstantiated instance, I swear I saw her standing near the lakefront during the fireworks on the 4th of July in 1976. She has confirmed that she was there that day but had been drinking, didn't remember which part of the lake she was standing on. There were thousands of people there that day. We have been married for 26 years now. I am still very much in love with her and I truly believe she is my soulmate. Dude, everyone believes she's your soulmate now. The only time in my life I've ever seen the Oscar Mayer Wiener Ball was when I was telling someone about it. They refused to believe it existed, and I was describing it to them, and then it drove by. I think I must have summoned it. I've been trying again, arranging various frankfurters in a pentagram surrounded by mustard-scented candles, but haven't had any luck. Went on a vacation to London. While there I met a man from Scotland. He found out I was from California and was like, Oh, I used to work with a guy in California. Maybe you know him. Internally I was rolling my eyes, but I didn't want to be the ugly American, so I humored him and asked for more information. The dude in California that the Scott had worked with turned out to be my father. When I was in high school, my best friend had just moved to town with her family, including her older sister who had a baby when she was 17. I spent a lot of time at her place and babysat the baby occasionally. She moved away a couple years later and we eventually fell out of touch. Cut to 2015. I meet a guy online. We hit it off and became FWBs and hang out quite a bit. In 2017 he gets a Facebook message from a young man claiming to be his son. The time frames and people involved all add up, and yes, it is indeed his son. He is telling me the story, mentioned the mother's name, and holy frick, it's the same name of my best friend's older sister. Turns out I was babysitting his kid he didn't know he had back in 1995. I had pictures of me with the baby and everything. I lived in an apartment in San Francisco for several years. I moved out. A couple of years later, I met a girl and we started dating. She lived in the exact same unit that I had lived in. I moved back into that unit. We have been married for 25 years. Played an MMO, EverQuest, for years. After about 5 years in, I got to talking to someone else who was in my guild that entire time. It turned out we lived in the same city, then the same neighborhood. We talk a bit more and come to realize we were next door neighbors and had been that entire time. Drove 300 miles to a beach and go into the bathroom as soon as we get there to take a pee. Only open urinal is next to my grandfather who lives right next door to me. Neither of us knew we were going there. I rolled a jump, scared him to make him pee everywhere as a joke, lol. I met a guy on a forum who had the same name as me, lived in the same town as me, and engaged in the same hobby as me. I told him we should meet to make sure we're not the same person. Ended up marrying the daughter of my high school wrestling coach about 12 years after I graduated. Had I known that my high school wrestling coach, when visiting his grandkids, would be walking around my living room in his underwear, I probably would have been less of a teenage donghead around him. Stumbled into a bar 4,000 miles from home, in another continent, and literally bumped into one of my closest childhood friends whom I haven't seen since I was 12. Totally unplanned. I live in Missouri, but was in London about 15 years ago because our college marching band was marching in their New Year's Day parade. I was marching on the left flank, dutifully playing my instrument, and decided to stop looking straight ahead like you're supposed to because I figured I'd never get a chance to enjoy this particular scenery again. If I hadn't been on the left hand side and glanced to my left in that exact moment, I never would have seen my cousin, also from Missouri and who I hadn't seen since I was a little kid, standing within an arm's reach with a shocked and confused look on her face. A lot of things had to coincidentally align for me to stroll past her on that particular street on the other side of the planet. I was shopping with my mom and my grandpa and I saw a cool Lego truck for 20 euros that I totally wanted. I asked my mom if I can have it. She says only if I buy it myself, fully knowing that I didn't have money on me because I was 11 or so, and of course normally my mom pays for everything and not some little kid. So instead my grandpa gave me €1 to buy a lottery ticket, or rather he bought it because gambling laws and so, and I just picked it. And I won exactly 20 euros. Highest winning any one of our family ever won in a lottery to this day. Nobody really plays much. You can bet that I bought that Lego truck. That's how you turn a kid into a gambler. I worked in a video store. I was picking up the returns to put them back in the system when I found a business card in the returns bin. It's the only time in 3 years that I ever found anything other than movies. We were 3 employees on that shift, so any of us could have found it. It was one of my brother's business card. He lives in another city and had no idea where I worked and when. I asked him about it and he has no idea how it got there. What are the chances that someone dropped it in my store on my shift and I would be the one to pick it up? It could have been someone who knew both of us playing a trick on me, but I moved in that city just 2 years prior and none of the people I knew there could possibly know my brother as well. I have another one. While signing the lease of our new apartment, the landlord realized that my so's name was familiar. It was a pretty big apartment building and they had a lost and found box. The landlord went and searched in the box and got my so's handbag that had her name written inside. She lost that handbag a year earlier during her vacation in British Columbia, 2,300 miles from here. We have no idea how it got there. I think the handbag might have been stolen and then sold to another tourist that ultimately took it back to your city. It's crazy how all that stuff aligned. Once I got a call from a school friend's number. I was 15 then and wasn't particularly close to this person, and her little cousin spoke to me, as though we were close friends, using my name etc. I was surprised but played along because she was little. Then when I spoke to this friend later, she said sorry and that she must have called by mistake. I got the call again the next day and played along again, and this time when I bumped into the friend, she sounded a little worried and said that she had to say something. She started crying. She said that the little girl was her cousin who used to live in the US and there she had a friend with the same name as mine and similar age as mine, and that they both were the closest of friends. And once she moved back to India, they discovered that she had a terminal illness for which she is being treated currently. Meanwhile, that guy with the same name died and they kept it from the little girl because it wouldn't have gone down well with her, and that she thought my number was actually his and spoke to me like it was him. I spoke to her 2 more times that week, this time very willingly and for a longer time. The last time I spoke to her, she was going for her surgery and I said that it'll all be fine. The next day, my friend breaks the news. She was hardly holding it together, but she was nice enough to bring me a few photos of her cousin. I was really glad I had the chance to keep her happy in her last few days. My chest. Went on a river float trip to the Frio River right after graduating high school. Sometime during the trip I lost my class ring. Next year, a guy that worked with my dad found it in the river, recognized the last name, and brought it back with him. I have since lost it again evacuating from a hurricane. Damn it. A few weeks ago, I mentioned and if wasn't for some random stranger on the internet, I wouldn't have been able to do that seamless cloud texture and fell out. I was in a pub at the time. A guy behind me tapped me on the shoulder. "You just been talking about Fallout 3, mate?" I was a bit confused, but said yeah, a mod I made for it a few years ago. The guy laughed. "I did that cloud texture for you. Hatics, right? Yeah, bloody heck." On my first solo trip to Europe during college, I attended a concert at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Paris. There I was in this packed cathedral, feeling a bit alone because of traveling by myself. When I looked to the right, I was amazed to see the person sitting next to me was my high school crush. She, too, was alone. From that point on, we shared everything together for the remainder of our stay. That's adorable. My full name is very unique. I've only been able to find one other person on Facebook with my particular name, and although it sounds exactly the same, the surname is a different spelling. Before I went to university a few years ago, I had to go to a couple of meetings regarding the course and some equipment I needed at a local business building. I was entitled to a grant that would cover a laptop and some relevant software. So I arrive and go to sign in, then I pause. I thought I'd had some sort of fugue or that somebody was playing a trick on me. My name was in the sign-in book. Apparently I'd signed in an hour previously and had left about 10 minutes ago. It was spelled exactly like mine. The first time I'd ever seen that in 30 years, and the handwriting even looked like mine. I unfroze myself and signed my name underneath with a furrowed brow. Then I worried quietly that I was having some sort of mental break until I walked into my meeting. The guy I was scheduled to see was brimming with excitement that my name was exactly the same as the woman who'd come in before me. He was shocked because it was clearly such a different name and the whole thing was an astronomical coincidence. We discussed the odds on it happening and how strange life can be sometimes. During this conversation he filled me in on a few details. Turns out we were on the same course, same meeting, same building, same specific grant being available to us. Perfect time of day for me to see her name in the book too. Had it been a few spaces higher I would have completely missed it. She was even my age. I spent the next year seeing her name pop up numerous times in sign-in books related to our course and having people commenting on it in baffled surprise. I never met her because she was attending the course though a different provider and our schedules never matched. It also never became normal. Whenever I saw her name I'd get a little jolt of recognition and then would have to force my brain that had been trained to think it was truly individual to conclude that yes, it was my name, but it wasn't me. Then I'd carry on with my day feeling decidedly fluttery. Weird year. My dad passed away when I was 2 years old. 20 plus years later, I was making a delivery of paint to a small little plant. These deliveries were just routine boring things. I would go in, drop them off, and have management there or someone high up sign off on the delivery. I do my delivery, an older man comes up, signs for it, and I head back to my truck. No small talk besides a low end sign there. Thanks. Get in my truck and head back to the shop. I get in and go to process my paperwork when I notice the man who signed for it has the same name as my dad, including my last name. He even wrote the first letter of his last name like I do. I haven't told anyone about it because I don't want to believe that my dad didn't die, but ran off. There's a headstone and proof of death, but this older man would have been the same age as my dad. The fact that it was the same first name and last name, along with how it was signed, always kept me thinking. When I was a little kid, my folks used to make me and my younger sister visit our great-grandmother in the nursing home. She was blind and like 98 years old. She was sort of scary as a kid, as her eyes were all frosted over, and she had papery skin, and would touch our faces to see how big we'd gotten. She had a tiny sing-songy voice. But what freaked me out more was her roommate who didn't talk at all except for reaching at me and saying my name. My folks never spoke to her other than to say hello and goodbye, or like Merry Christmas or whatever. Anyway, 20 years later I asked my dad what the frick that lady's deal was. He casually mentions it was my other great-grandmother, who was senile and bedridden. His family had a big falling out when he was a kid, so they never really knew each other. I look just like my dad and share his name, so she thought I was him, is the theory. They were roommates purely by coincidence. It was a pretty big nursing home in a pretty big city. To be honest, I am more floored by my dad's complete indifference to the situation than I am by the coincidence. That actually is a really crappy thing to do. He should have told you way sooner. A good friend died suddenly and tragically from pancreatic cancer. I was helping him fix his car after a hailstorm, and he was encouraging me to do something fun on my day off. Get out of town became our saying. Got to get out of town. Shortly after he died, a bunch of us went to a concert of his favorite band as a tribute to him. On our way there, we passed a brand new billboard. All it said was "Get out of town." It was probably for an airline or something, but it seemed too perfect. Too much of a coincidence. It's something I won't forget. I've had someone who knows me personally send this account a PM, only they didn't know it was me. My brother sent a meme to our family. I made that meme. Oh crap, what up? Growing up I had two imaginary friends, George and Lucy. They happened to be alligators, but that doesn't make any difference to this story. Fast forward about 20 years and my sister introduces me to her fiancé and his sister, who has the same name as me, and two children, George and Lucy, but sadly they're not alligators. It's like Jumanji. One day I was trying to find how to get in touch with a guy who I wanted to network with for a job and couldn't find out what company he had moved to. That afternoon I was shopping for couches on Craigslist and replied to an ad. It was that dude's couch. He invited me to his company for a meet and greet and I ended up getting a job there. Weirdest coincidence of my life. My family friends own a ranch in Texas. Growing up, I always visited on holidays. One trip, their grandfather gave me my first pocket knife, as I had just joined the Boy Scouts. I was out in the woods fricking around with my new knife when I heard a bunch of coyotes screaming nearby. If you haven't heard them scream before, it's pretty haunting. So, as I'm running back to the house I trip and faceplant. When I get back to the house, I realize I had lost the knife in my tumble. I felt absolutely terrible, and with it being full, and the handle of the knife made of wood, I pretty much lost all hope of finding it. I told their grandfather the next day. He proceeds to grab two rakes and we head off into the woods. I found a random spot and demonstrated my faceplant. When I looked down, the knife was right there. He recently passed this year. That man meant a lot to me, as does that knife, which I still have to this day. Just today I called my mum on the phone to ask if I could come over and she asked if I'll be there for dinner. When she said this I could smell spaghetti bolognese. When I got to her house, guess what was for dinner? Spaghetti bolognese. There was nothing around that could have possibly made me smell any sort of pasta dish, and she didn't say what we were having for dinner. That's because of your smell phone. I didn't want to be friends with a kid, age 7, because their mom looked mean. Age 15, same kids moved away after we dated, for like a month. Have a note saying I wasn't going to wait around for anyone I probably wouldn't ever see again. Age 20, they are my blind date. We have 3 kids. You have been visited by the ingenious Joe. Comment brain so you always see the glass half full. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.